Today is March the 10th, 2022. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and along with me is Larry Caldwell, an NRCS retiree. We're in Stillwater, Oklahoma, to speak with Congressman Ike Lucas, who has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1994.
Absolutely. Special election in May that year.
Okay. And has been instrumental in the writing of previous farm bills and as chair of the House Agricultural Committee. He has also been a champion for the NRCS Watershed program and has been instrumental in obtaining federal funding for the rehabilitation of aging flood control dams. This interview will be part of our Oklahoma's Conservation Heritage Oral History Project, which is a collaboration between the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. This will complement a 2016 interview, which is in the Caldwell and Everett County collection. So today we're going to concentrate on conservation, from his father's involvement with the local conservation district to the impact of the Dust Bowl on his family to the development of the farm bills, and touch upon whatever else he might want to in his 28 years in the Congress. So thank you for coming today.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with having you reflect on the impact of the historical droughts in your home county.
My family were not homesteaders in 1892 in the Cheyenne Arapaho land run. My father's family came in 1900 from Indiana. My mother's family came to Roger Mills County in 1905 by way of Cole County, eastern Oklahoma, from Colgate, or not from Corsicana in East Texas. They were cotton farmers. So my relatives haven't been there since the very beginning, but they were all there for the drought of the 1930s. My grandparents were all young men and women, raising children, trying to get by in that most complicated part of their life. My parents were married in 1955 as we were in the second year of that multi-year drought in the mid-1950s. And of course, my wife and I survived as cattlemen through the 2011 to 2014 droughts. And my father, who was a very history-oriented fellow, who lived all of his life in the county, always liked to reference the drought of the 1890s that some of the original homesteaders talked about, who came in the very beginning. So we've always had challenging weather in our part of Roger Mills County, Oklahoma. The story that my father liked to tell was from an old gentleman over at Leedy, that the first year they were Southerners, so they staked their homestead, bought the relinquishment, I'm not sure, but I think it was probably in the homestead in a run. They plowed the ground, planted the cotton, and it never rained. The cotton came up 1 year later when it finally rained. Now this is the 1890s. This is a story told by one of the folks who was there in the 1890s. My family were all around for the drought of the 1930s, which was different than the drought of the 1950s or what we went through in the last decade, in that there were good years and bad years. My great aunt and uncle, the place I live on now, my great uncle always liked to point out his best wheat crop he ever made, he sowed in 1934 and harvested in 1935. In the midst of all that misery, it had been tough a few years before. It was tough the next few years, but they'd survived all that. My parents came along in the 1950s. My father talked about, again, young couple, small children, trying to start, how tough it was. My father liked to discuss the wild lightning and thunderstorms they would have. You'd have these weather patterns come through, no moisture, but you'd have all this thunder, this lightning, you'd watch the lights flash, and just horrible. And of course, Linda and I came along for the drought of the last decade, where basically we probably had the most severe conditions. I had native grass pastures just dry freeze, just buffalo grass die. That's pretty amazing. My grandparents and my parents never talked about that in the 50s or the 30s. So we were a part of and lived through all of that misery, and add in a little economic depression in the 30s and a little economic depression in the early 80s. It all made it very challenging. So my father, my family were very enthusiastic people about soil conservation, about improved farming practices, about being good stewards of the soil, the water, the air, and everything. In my home area, we were doubly hit in the 1930s, not just the drought, but the Great Depression. We had 14,000 residents on census rolls in 1930. We made it back up in the last census to 3,400. So when you have that kind of an out migration, And they didn't leave because they wanted to, they starved out. I can remember as a kid, until the county commissioners finally acquired some really decent equipment, that every corner in North Roger Mills County was a blind corner because the dirt that had blown into the fence rows and collected year after year in the 30s and year after year in the drought of the 50s, you literally had fence rows that were 9 or 10 foot tall. So when you came to an intersection, you had a wall. You couldn't see. And when the commissioners acquired the kind of equipment that could do something about that, the first step was to open up all the blind intersections. And then over time, as we all became more prosperous, they would, if you take up your fence, they would come in and remove these giant dirt mounds and incorporate them in the road program, to the point now where if you drive down a dirt road in Roger Mills County, you don't see any of that anymore because it took 50, 60 years to repair the damage, but they overcame all of that. In my home county, and being a member of Congress, I work with agriculture and regions, not just Oklahoma, but across the country. One of the things that I always tell my cohorts and my constituents at home is trying to write a farm bill is the variation is so complicated. For instance, where I live, we measure soil in inches. We pray for rain to plant. We pray for rain to harvest, or to sow to get it up. There are places in this world where, in the Midwest, they measure their soil in feet. They pray for dry weather to plant. They pray for dry weather to harvest. My grandfathers would have spoken to me in terms that would be pretty straightforward if I'd asked for dry weather. It just was unacceptable. But it's a part of what makes conservation so complicated, because the needs and the environment, the climate, are so dramatically different across the country. Again, back to where I was raised, soil measured in inches. There's still places in pastures where you see these ulcerations, where so much topsoil was lost, 30s, 50s, that it just isn't, it's an ulcer. And I'd like to think all the efforts since modern conservation in the 1930s, and by the way, my first banker, who was my father's banker, my grandparents' banker, my great-grandparents' banker, was a fellow by the name of L.L. Red Males. And Mr. Males was a citizen activist in conservation a long time ago. And my grandfather said the first level in transit that was really available to farmers to try and lay out terraces to do things, the bank bought. And they would loan it out to people for so many days at a time. I mean, he bought an instrument, which was probably very expensive at the time in the late 20s. He loaned it out to his customers so they could begin those kind of practices. After the Hammond flood of 1934, which was a horrendous loss of life in Roger Mills County and over into Dewey and Custer County, Mr. Males became not just an activist working through the bank that he managed and ultimately owned for good conservation practices. He became a proponent of what would ultimately become the upstream flood control dam program, small watersheds, because Mr. Males understood that that flash flood that took the lives of 30-some of our fellow citizens, probably more who were just never found, he understood that there existed the ability to prevent or at least dramatically reduce the effect of those kind of events. And he became a super activist on the subject matter. In those days they used the phrase, Watershed Man of the Year, I believe in 56 or 57. After we did the language to create the rehabilitation program and we worked through several farm bill issues and all that and the other, I was very proud when the national group awarded me the Watershed Person of the Year, maybe 15 years ago now, because that was following the footsteps of a member of my community who was farsighted and very focused on it. So Mr. Males, for me, is kind of a legacy when it comes to the flood control dam issues. Back for a moment to my father and my immediate family. Being farmers by trade, and my grandparents were also grocers on the side, and my father was in the lumberyard business for a time and worked for the Upper Ouachita Conservation District for a time. my father always understood that we were in an environment that was so challenging and so difficult. One, you had to have an outside income to help make being able to live on and work on the farm possible. But he also, I think, understood how important it was to be so careful, so cautious with the resources. And in that case, water, soil, quality of the air. So careful with all that. And he was a big advocate. And he always liked to point out the difference between when he was a kid in the 30s and when I was a kid then in the 60s and 70s. After all of these conservation practices and the upstream flood control dams and terraces and the grass seedings and all the better technology and convincing people, and that was not just the USDA programs, but the extension programs through Oklahoma State, getting people to understand that if you left more cover, that you would collect more water, you would preserve more soil, you would have more pasture, you would have more productive property. He was a great believer and would point out the differences between being a kid and when he was a kid and I was a kid. And my father worked for the district for, I want to say 5 years, but I'm not entirely sure. He left in 77 to start a business. But my father, that was a period of time when the farm bills made a substantial amount of resources available to address just basic conservation, gully plugs, dams, terraces. And he and the actual USDA guy, Mr. Burns, Charlie Burns, in the days before the laser guided levels and all, carrying those poles, shooting that transit, they staked hundreds of dams every year. My father's always very proud of that. Matter of fact, he pointed out once to me that at the time there were 5, maybe 6 people who were involved in what he called the dirt contractors, the bulldozer people, the folks who implemented those practices, working simultaneously in the Upper Ouachita Conservation District area. And Mr. Burns, Charlie, was very focused that they had to have an aggressive enough schedule on doing the prep work, staking the structures, supervising the construction, certifying the results, so that not only could the farmers and ranchers get their cost share to make it possible to do the programs, but Charlie was wanted to make sure those contractors had work, because that was how they and their families were eating. So it was a very aggressive effort for the right reason. In Roger Mills County, the Upper Ouachita Conservation District area has benefited immensely from it. My father loved what he did, and after walking through those plowed fields carrying a pole for so many years, he decided to do something a little different, and I understand that completely. But for the modern generation that's never driven down a county road where the fence row has so much dirt in it and so much brush and crud that you can't see the field and you can't see who's coming when you're at the intersection. And even in the 60s, I remember some of the grazing practices that were still horrible. There were no wildfires because there was nothing to burn, which also meant there was not to hold the water, which meant there was not to hold the soil. All of those things that made such a difference. And again, my father, the old family banker, and the people who are involved in the Old Soil Conservation Service, now the NRCS, for Charlie Burns to Russell Salisbury in the Cheyenne office, Joyce Barton, who was the paper person, I guess we'd call it secretary in those days, the administrator now. We're all very dedicated, enthusiastic people. And in those days, Mr. Males, again, being the activist, helped start and sponsored, as long as he was alive, the National Pasture and Range judging contests in Roger Mills County, because we have a substantial amount of Black Kettle National Grasslands, part of the 1936 bill to return certain private properties to the public domain through purchase. So there was a lot of different grass types and soil conditions. It was a great place to have the contest, and Mr. Males was very enthusiastic about that, and it drew people from all over the state, all over the country.
And it's still going on.
Still going on. Just a really important thing. Again, I'm very fortunate to have been related to or known or worked with a whole bunch of good folks who we now benefit from their efforts. Now, when I went to Congress, having understood that mission, part of my goal, because so many of the conservation programs come under USDA and the Farm Bill jurisdiction, was to make sure that not only did we continue those commitments, but that we try to expand and meet all the potential needs out there. I'd been a member for 8 years and had the privilege of becoming the subcommittee chairman on the House Agriculture Committee for the committee on, the subcommittee was Conservation, Rural Development, and Agricultural Research. So all of these topics fell right under the bailiwick of that. And I remember sitting down with my chairman at the time and telling him how many billion new dollars I needed, because there was this backlog all over the country. Because I'd gone to USDA and I had said, if you had enough money to implement all the cost share practices that have been requested or the preliminary work has been done on, what would the number be? And I'd have to look that up for you now, but it was billions. And I remember making this pitch to my full committee chairman. I'm a fellow committee chairman, and they all looked at me like I was silly because it was a huge number. But ultimately, in the Farm Bill that passed that year, we met that number, and we had what I thought was a sufficient cushion. Now, as soon as the bill was signed into law, the money became available, and producers all over the country understood, if I go down, I can really get that done. Oh my goodness, and poof, it was all used, committed, and the demand was increased. But that was okay, because everything that was being done was a good use of taxpayer dollars in a preservation of resources for the nation that would be enhanced for years, generations to come. So I'm very proud of the 2002 Farm Bill. Even if my colleagues chuckled at me about what I thought I needed, and they ultimately met it with even more. And I would also argue that the conservation section of the Farm Bill from 2002 on was a big element in passing the overall Farm Bill. Because Farm Bills are social nutrition programs. They're what we think of as the traditional commodity programs, crop insurance, that sort of stuff, all these other issues. But conservation was a topic that drew people from both suburb America, support from rural America, the inner city areas, because, I mean, after all, if you used a hook or you liked to throw a bullet or you enjoyed a camera lens, those resources enhanced your experience, everybody's experience. So the Farm Bill has become a three-legged stool: nutrition, production, conservation, as it should have been. So I'm very proud of that. When I was chairman of the full committee, we stabilized the stream of money for the upstream flood control rehab program. And that actually, I started on that bill prior to being the chairman in 2002. Matter of fact, the chief of the NRCS paid a little call on me in western Oklahoma back in, was it 99 or 2000? Right along in there somewhere, 98? It was right along in there. 98.
The Cordell 50th anniversary.
So we loaded up in a helicopter. They really didn't need to reinforce my enthusiasm, but they thought they were helping reinforce my enthusiasm. We loaded up in a helicopter in a nice warm afternoon, and then we went bouncing around western Oklahoma. And the beautiful part about a helicopter and a half a day, not only could you get a real feel for the condition of structures, but like flying around Elk City and examining all of the flood control structures that had been built out in the countryside, but were now just on the north and the west edges of town, that were not just providing flood protection from that point all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, but literally providing protection for the community, the city, the town, and not just Elk City, but all over the country. It was a good reinforcement, and it provided me with a message that could be delivered based on real experience. And I give Chief Reed credit. He was an enthusiastic supporter. In the federal government, you have your three branches, and sometimes to make things happen, or almost every time to make things happen, it's a pulling and pushing program. And the executive branch, in this case, the NRCS, understood the structures needed to be saved, and they only could be saved if we had a rehabilitation program, and we had resources that we could match with state and local entities, and we take into credit enhanced easements, and there was a variety of value-added things to make it all work out. But if we didn't have that kind of a vehicle, then as the lawyers told us, once the structures passed their 50-year life expectancy, no matter what the condition, they would be considered a legal hazard. And basically the lawyers told us, you remember, we're going to cut a V in every one of them. We're not going to ever let any water be blocked, because then that's the only way to mitigate the risk. And I can remember as we were flying along looking at those dams, where's all that topsoil going to go? Mm-hmm. Because from the 1970s on, we'd done a really good job when one of those structures was built of going up above it and putting in smaller structures or planting grass in a way to slow down the silt. But the older ones, dating back to the 40s, maybe even late 30s experimental ones, that really hadn't been a thought. And there were some real silt pools that had built up. And it was possible to make the case to my environmental and sportsman friends, what is that X number of tons of soil, silt, going to do to your habitat downstream to the next fishing pond? And we found some allies to help us put the piece of legislation together. Then when I was subcommittee chairman, we were able to secure a funding stream, because in the process you authorize, but you also have to have appropriations to fund what you've authorized. And the O2 Farm Bill gave us the ability to fund. And took a little bit to win some people over, not only in Oklahoma, but around the country, that this was a good use of funds. But once they came to understand that not only were we protecting this asset that the investment had made in, not only were we protecting everything downstream if this asset had to go away and all these unintended consequences occurred, but we also, with the improved technology, the metals and the valve works, all that sort of stuff, I think the engineers are pretty honest. Those 50-year dams were becoming 100-year dams after they were rehabbed. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many things do we do in the federal government that will still be functioning from 50 years ago to 100 years into the future? Not many. The best concrete bridges, the best asphalt roads, the best everything has to be changed out dramatically more often than that. Super cost effective. So we pursued that.
I think part of the story there, if you could touch on that 1998 celebration is when you had the first field hearing. And then within 2 years after that, you'd gone through all the hearings, all those co-sponsors, and it was passed. How did you get all of those congressmen together that weren't from rural areas and all to buy into this? I think you had quite an effort and quite a story there.
Well, the United States House is a group of 435 people. It's relationships, it's trust. It is presenting a focused, rational message that is verifiable. And we worked very diligently from that first helicopter flight through the hearing process. And in Congress, sometimes I know the hearings that people watch on C-SPAN late at night when they can't sleep, they seem all boring, but it is a necessary part of building the official record, gathering facts, having witnesses who have to answer questions about those facts. And we slowly and methodically built that. And the rehab program then was so successful that when we got to the 2018 bill, I did the 2014 bill, and 2018 was then a modification of my farm bill. I was able, working with the committee and my friends again, to do something that we'd long talked about, which was take the new dam construction program away from being an earmark kind of a thing where the House never did earmarks. So only certain senators got new dam construction, basically. Mm-hmm. And we moved it to an organized, systematic, need-based, factually scored priority list, the way we did rehab. Remember? Mm-hmm. Rehab had to be based on a set of criteria that could not be questioned, because if it appeared that some House member was just fixing all of his dams and nobody else's,
Yep.
That was not going to enable us to build a permanent process to save them all. And we followed that, and by the way, that helped. It made it dramatically easier in 18, creating this program to do new dam construction when you could hold up the rehab program, which had been above and beyond question. Even the appropriators couldn't argue with us about how the money had been used. I'm proud of that too. Now, my mission from this point on, there are, I forget off the top of my head how many thousand new upstream flood control dams that are in some phase of approval or engineering or the process of being requested, increasing the new money stream so that we can speed up the construction. And again, for folks who are not aware of what we're talking about, the concept is to take a number of smaller earthen structures, design them on a watershed so that they become interlocking structures. Instead of building one giant Lake Texoma dam, you have 2 or 3 or a dozen of these structures catching water and together having dramatic storage for a very short period of time. I will acknowledge some of these structures are great fishing, I'm told. I haven't had time to fish in a long time. Some of them are even public water sources. They're that good. But most structures catch the flood water and then meter it out over a period of days or weeks and then go back to dry so that if there's another flood experience, they can instantly snap back to the service. I've always said that if we could complete the upstream flood control structure program across all of North America where it's appropriate, there's no telling how many hundreds of billions of dollars we would save. There's no telling how many lives or how many bird nesting areas or how many quality fish habitat that we would preserve. But it's not as exciting as this, that, or the other that gets a pop or bang tomorrow. And as we live more and more in a society where immediate gratification, both politically and personally, is the focus, it makes it harder to do these kind of things that require more effort, take more time, that the benefits accrue in a slower way than maybe some people think is appropriate, but ultimately pay such a huge long-term set of dividends. The structures that we rehab now, or we put in new now, with the valve works and the designs, the better riprap systems, the letdowns, the rock, all that sort of stuff, I personally think there will be a lot of the structures where we also do the upstream soil control. A lot of the structures, they'll come back in 100 years and say, maybe we just need to stamp this for another 100 and go on. That'll be even more remarkable. But I think it's certainly possible.
I do too.
Certainly possible.
Affects a lot of future generations there that we don't realize today.
Oh, yes. The number of people who fished in those things and didn't understand where that dam came from.
Well, you were lucky you knew where it came from when you showed up in D.C. to begin with.
Oh, absolutely.
For the most of it.
See, most of my colleagues in Congress want to do the right thing for the right reason. But Congress is a cross slice of America. It's a big old country. There's a lot of different priorities, a lot of different circumstances. And the lion's share, even though they want to do the right thing, they don't know what the right thing is, which is why I always point out it's important that we, not just members of Congress trying to educate each other, but it's important that folks back home in roles as, and I'm a little hesitant to use the phrase, but citizen activists should be the phrase. If you care about the environment, if you care about wildlife, if you care about the future of our natural resources, everyone has a stake in this. I mean, because like those dams in Roger Mills County, that flood protection they start protects everything to the Gulf of Mexico, or on the west side of the Rockies, everything to the Pacific, and everyone downstream. But to make sure that these kind of less than political sexy programs continue to exist and exist in a way that they can actually increase the ability to meet the needs, it requires people to be involved. For instance, on upstream flood control, there's money from the federal government. So yes, you want to talk to your senator and your congressman. You want to write a letter to the president how important this is. But it also involves money from the state of Oklahoma, for instance, from state government. So talking to your state representatives, your state senators, writing that letter to the governor is important. We need that cost share. Talking to local government, because some of these things involve easements and zoning now, and there's contributions, and the folks who help finance the local conservation districts, all those pieces need to be in play. Because as we learned on an occasion or two, if you happen to have federal money, but you can't get the cost share match from the state, or the local entity just doesn't think it's worth it, then it's not going to happen. And that's a tragedy. Because if under our priority system, if your dam qualifies to be rehabbed, or if you've got a site that scores high on new dam construction, there's a need there. I mean, there's a real need there. If it scores in the system we have now, then it needs the effort in helping make that happen. I've spent time talking to state legislators. I've talked to governors. I've worked with my colleagues back east.
On both sides of the aisle.
Both sides of the aisle. Yeah. No, there's no party label when it comes to protecting the soil, the water, the air. There's no party label for that.
You have to be one of the few, or maybe the only farmer rancher in Congress that really understands this. Is that a real challenge, talking with some of these folks that have their own priorities and needs to?
It is, and that's why I spend so much time talking about the camera lens, the fish hook, the scope on the rifle, trying to address this to a broader slice. I mean, from a nutrition point, from a production point, of course, these structures keep our base productivity in where it should be. So that's important. But by bringing in the conservationist, the sportsman, the wildlife enthusiast, the bird watchers, all of that thing, all that sort of stuff, the monarch butterfly people, where the butterflies like to occasionally stop in the shelter belts as they're cruising along too, going north and south. That's how we build the coalition to make things happen. That's how we make it cool, fun. Okay, cool dates me. Whatever the proper term is this day and time. That's how we make it worthwhile. And we get support. Because there's lots of competing demands out there for every cent of taxpayers' money. And I always remember that's somebody's money. That came out of somebody's pocket. They had to work so hard to pay those taxes, so we have to spend it in a way that is in their best interest. But again, I can't think of anything that will pay a longer-term dividend. And from my perspective as a fifth-generation Roger Millsite, the world before modern conservation was a tough thing. There was an old Southern phrase, mining the soil. Started on the East Coast in colonial times. You farmed the property till the soil failed, and then you just moved on to the next spot. Well, there's no more soil to farm. We have to protect what we have. We have to be good stewards. And I don't ever want to live like my grandparents talked about, wetting the sheets to hang in the windows to keep the dust out of the house in the 30s. I don't ever want to have an environment that's so tough that 10,000 of my 14,000 neighbors starve out and have to go to somewhere else. And in fairness, there's some long-term issues. Part of, I think, my legislative success in Congress has been focusing very intensely on the language, getting the input, cross-referencing with people, trying to write bills that stand the test of time, like the rehab program. Now, oh my goodness, 20 plus years old. Stand the test of time. There have been occasions in the past where my predecessors in Congress, through no ill intent, made mistakes that set off chain reactions that have a dramatic long-term effect. I consider the Homestead Act of 1862 to be one of the great, amazing things, along with the Morrow Act, setting up the land-grant universities, both signed by President Lincoln. But in the case of the Homestead Act, there were some fundamental mistakes made in 1862 that would bring total chaos in the 1930s to where I live. What do I mean by that? The Homestead Act was designed essentially for the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa. As my grandfather used to say, though the side of the family that came from Indiana, in Indiana, 160 acres of corn farm, you could feed 6 kids, 2 hogs, 3 horses, and a dog. You could do that. But the soil was measured in feet. It rained when it was supposed to. Where we live, you couldn't do that. Instead of 160 acres in Roger Mills County, it probably should have been 1,600 acres because the productivity would have been the equivalent of the 160 in Indiana, Illinois, or Iowa. And I understand why that would have been so complicated at the time, but putting people in a place where the resources didn't match the way the legislation had originally intended for was setting them up for a tough time. And those ulcers I talked about earlier that you can still see in certain fields, pastures in my home county are a reflection of that. So I try to make sure that we don't create those kind of problems ever again. I don't want people to suffer when they're playing by the rules, following the law, trying as hard as they can, which my neighbors, the folks ahead of me, I'm sure they all did well in California, or Oregon. And I had relatives who picked peaches and picked cotton out there too in the 30s and then came home. So lots of pieces.
But it seems like you were a champion at the time for agriculture, at a time where you really pulled the bipartisan efforts from all sides of the aisle. Is that getting to be harder and harder to do?
It's extremely difficult. We live in a society where everyone is focused on immediate gratification. We live in a society where, of course, I'm on the science committee as well as the legacy guy on the ag committee. I can remember when the internet first started coming together. There was very optimistic, hopeful discussion that this free flow of knowledge would create a great discussion base, the great debate. We'd share information. Everything would be wonderful. We'd be more enlightened. It would be like having the Carnegie Library in your living room.
Yep.
Remember?
Yep.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm old enough to remember how important that library was when I was a kid. And there was no internet, remember? The encyclopedia set? Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness.
And the card catalog.
Card catalog. Oh, that card catalog at Oklahoma State University was awesome. That was just awesome. But unfortunately, in some ways, the internet has become a gossip session where people scream at each other and use it to market for short-term gain things that are silly, ideas, concepts. So in Congress, part of the challenge is overcoming that and getting people to think in a rational, focused way. Because the needs are still there. The information is still there. It's like I tell my constituents sometimes. Did you cross-reference that? Did you look that up on some other source? Did you at least look up the name of the person who posted that? Mm-hmm. Just do that for me and we'll talk about it. But, oh my, your mama told you not to believe the gossip at school. Your mama told you not to repeat the gossip you heard at the local store. You just have to treat the internet the way our mothers, our fathers taught us to handle things in the old days. It's just, now it's anonymous instead of the neighbor telling you.
And that's making it more difficult to have any bipartisan.
So in the legislative process, you have a tendency because everything's a short-term focus, I have a tendency for my colleagues, some of them, to figure out that if they'll go to the corner and scream, it will generate the most amazing $50 and $100 contributions. Now, I understand the concepts of marketing, but truth's important too, and long-term consequences. But I still am in a body where, as a member, by working hard enough with my friends on both sides of the aisle and being almost painfully honest with them up front, you can still get people to look past the silliness and focus on the facts. My greatest accomplishment in the 2014 Farm Bill, my greatest accomplishment was, it took 2.5 years to do what should have been 6 months. But after about a year into the process, my cohorts, both R's and D's, came to realize that maybe I was the one who was the most consistent with the facts. Because when someone would come to me, it didn't matter where they were from, when they come to me and ask a question, I would say, well, here's what that will do. And that might not be good for your constituents, or that might be too complicated for you to be a part of politically, but here's why this works. And no, that's, the point is, I was absolutely honest and developed a level of trust among my friends so that when we would get into key points in that last year, putting the Farm Bill together, they'd come to me and they'd say, well, so-and-so said, or leadership said, or that think tank group said, what's the truth? And I would say, well, it's this and this and this and this. And if you do that, this will happen, and I'm not sure that group's not trying to do this to you, but always completely honest about it, good and bad. And then you develop those kind of relationships. And the 14 Farm Bill, the third generation rewrite, passed by a partisan vote. I had a majority on both sides of the room. May not have had all the leadership people on either side of the room, but I had a majority of R's and D's. And nobody who voted with me on the Farm Bill lost their reelection. That's putting your colleagues in jeopardy, which is occasionally what my fellow members will do for their short-term gain. That's unacceptable. What is that? Burn me once, shame on me. Burn me twice. Yeah. So.
But that approach is going to be critical in the next Farm Bill, especially.
Oh yes.
Who will be chairing that? Or will you?
We have term limits to be chairman on the Republican side. I have a feeling that the House control swing in the 2022 election, in this next general election. I'll be back in the majority. I'll be sitting next to the chairman, I anticipate. But it depends how many faces we have, because then you have to start this educational process. The House is turning over rapidly. When I got there, no member was a chairman of a relevant committee, didn't have 30 years seniority. The subcommittee chairman had been there at least 20 years. Well, I've now chaired the major subcommittee, been a ranking member of it, chaired a full committee, been a ranking member of the science committee, and before I've crossed the 30 mark, I will be full chairman, I believe, of the science committee too. And that's just incredible, the turnover. Just incredible, the turnover. But it also means being one of the folks who've been around and developed the relationships from the front of the room working back, it puts me in a position to make sure that the legacy work that we've all invested so much effort in, both inside and outside of Congress, won't be lost. It'd be a terrible thing to have the rehab program go away, or to go back to the silliness of earmarks on the new dam construction, or to not have enough money for all the EQIP practices, because there's a variety of conservation things out there that are funded.
Do you know how many representatives are there today that were there when you first started in 1994?
Well, out of 435, I think I'm maybe number 18 when the election's over with this time.
That's a big turnover.
Huge turnover. Yeah, huge turnover.
Is there someone coming up the pike that can fill your shoes, or at least come close to filling your shoes from a conservation standpoint?
I am constantly working with upperclassmen, underclassmen to try and get the right person focused in that way. There's some enthusiastic people. They're not quite ready yet, but there's some enthusiastic people. The other thing that I work on is trying, as my colleagues go from the House to the Senate, to develop some Senate friends who care as much as I think we do on the House Ag Committee. Because it's a bicameral body. You need somebody on the other side too. And we've had actually really good NRCS chiefs in my time. And very supportive secretaries of the full department. I'm very fortunate about that.
And for a time, you worked with Wes Watkins on some of these issues?
Oh, yes. Wes had been a member of Congress before I went to Congress, ran for governor, didn't quite work out. And then after I got to Congress, he came back. Oh, my goodness. Wes had been an appropriator when he was first in Congress, and then he came back on the Ways and Means Committee, the tax writing committee. So Wes was the guy in charge of the annual appropes, and then he was the fellow in charge of the 40-year tax policy. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody work so hard on behalf of his constituents. Because Wes is one of these people, he loved those folks in eastern Oklahoma, particularly southeastern Oklahoma. He was one of them, as I'm one of mine, constituents too. I can remember Wes had an issue dealing with a business tax credit of some sort that was primarily focused on eastern Oklahoma. And it was, whatever year it was the last window of opportunity. And he had the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Bill Thomas from California, cornered in the hallway. And he was leaning into him like he was selling a secondhand horse. I mean, he was leaning in hard. He got it done. The tenacity of Wes, that's the thing. He just, once he locked on, and if it mattered to his district, Oklahoma for that matter, rural America, and after all, Wes was an old state FFA president. I mean, he was one of us to the core from day one. And came from very humble beginnings, self-made person. I particularly respect those kind of people.
Also a big champion of the Watershed program.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And has a reservoir named after him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Most appropriate.
I had one question back when you were talking about your dad. He was involved in this in the heyday of the Watershed program. You were a teenager about that time when he was working with SCS in the Upper Watchtower Conservation District. Did you ever go out with him, or your experiences with seeing the dams that were being built around that time, did you realize what was happening at that time when you were a teenager?
I just knew the big structures were appearing. You know, it's hard when you're 14-year-old male to pay long-term attention to many things. My father was just enthusiastic about it, and he would come in tired every evening because they worked, again, before modern technology with those poles, and they didn't have four-wheelers to go bouncing around the pasture. They picked up the equipment and they carried it, and they stomped through the dirt and did it hour after hour after hour. But he loved it. And in those days, there was a lot of practice like gully plugs, and they were still, laying out the diversions to sow grass to old fields that people then would sow grass to old fields. It was still in the days of trying to repair the worst of the 1930s and 50s damage.
And that work is still there?
Still there, still ongoing.
Still working?
I mean, my experiences on EQIP, like the upstream flood control programs, whether it's new construction or rehab, it's not will we ever have too much money. It's how much can we manage to set aside every day, because if the resources are there and they know they're there, the districts and the farmers and ranchers will come use them. It's not wasted, and there's never extra. So that's part of the 2002 thing why I'm so proud that we jumped up.
Mm-hmm. And that was very early in your career.
Yes,
Early in your career.
Yes.
Did you imagine you would still be talking about this 20-some years later?
I probably was just happy to have gotten there in the special election and wasn't focused too much past the end of the term. You have to do long-term planning, but by the same token, in a body where you have a 2-year contract, you just work as frantically as you can to move those priorities as quick as you can and try to establish a legacy and program expectations so that the good things will help whoever comes after you pull them into supporting to continuing them.
Well, I think conservation will definitely be in your legacy, a good chunk of it.
As I said, I was very proud of being the Watershed Person of the Year when I was, following in the footsteps of my old banker 50 years before, who'd been the Watershed, in those days, Man of the Year. World changes some.
So about how big is this farm bill? I can't imagine, is it multiple volumes?
The average year it's about that thick
that
and
big.
about, and then you've got, oh, what would you say, Larry? Probably 20,000 pages of regulations that match up with the
That come up
2,000
with it.
pages of bill. And then there's the policy books and the procedures and the rules that are promulgated. It's
And you know those
paperwork
inside and
wise,
out.
well, I know well enough to know where we need to add to and someday maybe add a few less pages. But in the world we live in now, with the public safety issues and environmental issues and all the zoning stuff and dealing with contractors, I mean, it's just evolved into what it has to be. But good things still get done. Just a little more paperwork, which frustrates all real conservationists.
It may be a little slower, but
Yeah.
better
Patience.
than never.
Better than ever. Yeah. No, I'm proud of my time in the movement, and I'm happy to have been raised by and been around people who were enthusiastic about it long before, because there's lots of Ike Lucases and Red Males all over the country. That's why we have what we have. Just lots of good folks.
Okay.
The Ouachita district used to have, and they somehow disappeared, but they had pictures when I was a kid. I remember my father showing me in the files of the Hammond flood of 34 and the railroad tracks with the cross ties still tied to the track where the washed out underneath and twisted it like corkscrews, and the buildings up in trees and dead horses and that kind of stuff. That just was down the creek from us, so to speak. Well, a few miles, but down the river. And those folks never had a chance. They didn't know it was coming. It just got them one night.
6 people in one family there in Adams family.
Are there any of these watershed structures on your property or the property that you own?
No, actually, there's not any of the upstream flood controls. There are a number of smaller dams built under different programs down through the years. Where we're at was never actually the right spot for one of these really outstanding examples of engineering. I'd like to have the fishing hole too, but not in the right place.
But
But I could see them from my property.
they benefited from them in one way or the
Well,
other.
absolutely. Everybody who lives below one of these structures from here to New Orleans benefits from it. Everybody. Because once you start that flood rolling, it just keeps on rolling. Everybody benefits from it. And I listen to the tragedies that occur in flooding around the country every year, and I think, especially in rural areas, if we just had the structures, it either wouldn't have happened or it would have been dramatically less destructive.
Really, you've had a good colleague, Larry,
Oh,
through the
best.
years, yes.
We spent a lot of quality time together
Yeah. Great experience. Fantastic.
and accomplished. I'm not sure everybody in the beginning believed we could get a rehab program, and I know nobody thought we could get an orderly funding mechanism for new construction.
So what was the key to getting it? Can you pinpoint one or two things?
I finally had to persuade my House colleagues that because we didn't do earmarks, there were no pet dam construction programs in the House, that if it was going to be equitable and fair, we had to take the system that had worked on rehab so well, and we had to modify it to reflect new construction, but we had to have that same system for new construction, because then with an orderly way of meeting the most dramatic needs systematically, it would be easier to go to the appropriators and say, well, we've met this critical set of structures, but if we had a little more money, we could meet the next critical set of structures where there are 50,000 people living downstream or 20,000 people living downstream, or we've got this unique habitat downstream that would be devastated if we had one of these 10, 12-inch rains that eventually happen everywhere if we weren't prepared. It would appeal to their logic. Sometimes people will do the right things for the right reasons if you give them enough facts.
Yeah, you had your facts.
And I had my facts, and they knew I wasn't being greedy. I was being a team player for the common good, as we all have been.
Well, we sure appreciate you being a member of the team, leading the team.
Absolutely.
And we'll let you close with that and get to your next place. So thank you for making time for us.
Thank you very much.